All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back after reading week. I hope you got some rest in. I know I did. I hope you also, for those of you who have finished your paper, that it went well. For those of you who are still finishing it, I hope that you feel like you're mid-process, and good luck on the other things that are going on in your lives. So like I said before the start of the break, we're shifting gears now. We're moving from a kind of big picture to a how do you do it. And we're linking what's happening this week with the start of our final project. So we'll talk more about this in class. There's more about this on the website, the Brightspace website, so you can go through all of that. But I wanted you guys to start thinking about the act of starting to carry out research and how that goes. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, and we'll be talking about the first step. So let me share my screen. Okay, so we are sharing, sorry, I'm trying to get everything working appropriately. So let's talk about what it means to carry out a literature review. So McGregor talks about the idea that you can do literature reviews at a couple of different steps in, the research process. And in particular, she says that people who are proceeding from a more positivist or quantitative, she uses quantitative, but I want to specify positivist methodology, frequently will do all of their literature review at the beginning and then use it to develop hypotheses and then test those hypotheses. And then not go back to the literature at the end, right? Whereas qualitative researchers, in the way she talks about it, are more likely to start the research and then turn to the literature to help them understand it. And what I think is very true is that researchers turn to the literature at both of those points, right? And spend time at both of those points, reading and trying to understand what other researchers have found. For our purposes, we're focusing on the literature you conduct before you begin a project. Should any of you go on to do a master's degree and you're writing a master's thesis, or go on to do a doctorate and you're writing a dissertation, you will find that the first literature review you do to start off your process is great. And then you realize there's a whole bunch more stuff you need to read later, right? That's a natural part of the process. But for right now, we're focusing on how you kick things off. And so it's worth pausing to say, what is the literature, right? Sorry, y'all. So this is a kind of vague term, I think, and it's worth kind of being very specific about what we mean when we say the literature. We mean the arguments that have been gathered and presented by other researchers over time about this topic. That's what we're supposed to have a grip of. There's a great video out there, or there's a blog post called The Illustrated Guide to a PhD, and if you want to Google it, and somebody made a video version of it, which is cute. But the whole point is that kind of the purpose of understanding the literature is to kind of get all of this history of studying the idea, right? Another thing that I want to just emphasize is that I think sometimes students treat research papers, research-based books or other forms of scholarly communication, you treat them as facts about the world. You treat them the way you would treat a textbook or a newspaper. And that makes sense. Those are genres of writing you're much more familiar with. But in fact, what a research project is about is it's actually an argument, right? And it's an argument supported by evidence, right? So the evidence is information about the world. If this is based on empirical argument, then it's about the data, right? So you have data about a particular thing, and you're using this evidence to make an argument, right? You don't have to agree with somebody's argument in order to find their data useful. You don't have to be working on exactly the same type of data to find an argument useful, right? And in fact, oftentimes some of the sharpest academic disagreements are about the differences in how data is analyzed and interpreted, and what kinds of arguments particular types of data can support. There are also big arguments about the quality of the evidence, and also like whether the evidence is well used. These are kind of big parts of how academics work. But your job when you're faced with a scholarly article is to assess the argument and the evidence, and kind of make sure that you understand what the argument is, what evidence is being used for that argument, whether that evidence seems to be well constructed, and whether the argument is actually well supported by that evidence, right? That's your job, is to focus on the evidentiary part of it. And so why do we do any of this? It's because we're trying to build, right? If I want to write something, I don't start like in midair, right? I start on this big pile of books, quite literally actually, that other people have built. And that's true even if nobody has studied my topic before. All right. Now, in some cases, I will be looking at something so specific that nobody has studied it, right? You know, for the article I referenced a couple of weeks ago on a particular hashtag, I wasn't able to find anything. First of all, there was like a BuzzFeed list on that hashtag. That's what was written about that hashtag. Second of all, how self-identified Muslim communities interact on Twitter, there was nothing on that I was able to find, right? That stuff wasn't available. However, there was plenty of stuff on how Twitter works, on how Twitter communities work. I actually got a lot of knowledge from reading scholars of Black Twitter, right? Because again, they were trying to say like, here is a Twitter space shaped by an identity that people share with each other, right? And so that made perfect sense to me. So, you know, that's what I mean. You have to go, you're not the first person to ever write about anything ever, right? The other thing is that you already have knowledge, right? You wouldn't know there's a question to be investigated if you didn't already know something about the issue. And so the whole purpose of the literature review is to get beyond what you personally as an individual know because of like where you are, and to really get a sense of what other people have done. You don't need to agree with their conclusions. In fact, sometimes, particularly I feel like for researchers doing a PhD, the kind of first stage of the process is like, everybody else has studied this thing wrong, right? Like, nobody has done exactly what I'm doing, and therefore my project is important, right? Like, that's a very common move. And I think it's often justified, right? Like, usually there's a good reason where you can say, I want to study this differently. But you can only really do that once you actually understand what the literature is saying. So how do you start a literature review? It's actually very challenging when it seems like it should be the easiest thing in the world, because there are kind of two potential approaches that will mess you up. The first is, I mean, I use here the metaphor of launching yourself at the entirety of human knowledge like a giant ball pit. You know, you cannot just cannonball into everything, right? No matter, like, if you want to say, I want to study Canadian politics, right? Okay, what do you want to study about Canadian politics, right? I want to study elections. Well, gee, there are about 1 billion things you could study about elections. What about them do you want to study, right? So the first thing you have, so if you're kind of at the level of, which I think some of you guys are going to be for your project in this class, if you're at the like, okay, I'm in a group that's about elections, what do we want to study? Like, you can't go out and start your literature review by thinking, well, we'll read 10 articles on elections. Like, no, those articles might have nothing to do with each other, right? So you want to get more focused. So you might want to say, is there a particular type of this thing that I'm interested in? So if you want to study elections, maybe you're interested in first past the post systems rather than PR systems, right? Well, that gets you a much smaller number of cases to look at. Maybe you're interested in studying a particular country or region of the world, right? So maybe if you say you want to study political violence, well, then maybe you say, I want to study political violence in Canada. And that gets you to a much smaller list of things to be looking at, right? Maybe there's a time period you're interested in. Maybe you want to compare two time periods, or maybe you're really interested in what happened at a certain point in time, right? So the first step, if you've got something like elections, right, is to get smaller, right? And you don't want to get super, super, super narrow at that stage, right? But just to start moving it in so that you can actually focus. But the other thing is you can get too focused. You can get like super, super micro on something. So the example I give here, right, like your research question is how the linguistic diversity of Ottawa affects the process and outcome of municipal elections. I came up with that on the spot for this PowerPoint, and I'm like, oh, that's actually a super interesting question, and I now want to know the answer to it. I have this problem sometimes that I make up imaginary projects. Okay, you've got that question. But if you look to see who else has conducted research on linguistic diversity, Ottawa, and municipal elections, the answer is probably nobody, right? And in fact, that's kind of a good thing because that means your work is filling a niche, right? So you have to go one level up, right? So maybe linguistic diversity in municipal elections. Maybe somebody's written about Ottawa, right? Maybe somebody's written about Canadian municipal elections and they have some useful tools for you, right? You could even say municipal elections in medium-sized cities and other wealthy democracies, right? So Ottawa is about the same size as Jacksonville, Florida. Jacksonville, Florida is also a highly multicultural city that is also majority white, right? So maybe there's some kind of useful comparison about Jacksonville, right? I picked Jacksonville because I'm currently conducting research in Jacksonville. So that's why Jacksonville is on my mind. Also, my best friend lives there. Also, I'm watching The Good Place, which mentions Jacksonville a lot accurately. Right, so kind of these sorts of things, right, are what you might want to look at. So when you're reading for a literature review, right, this is quite similar to what you guys did or are doing for your short paper, right? Which is to say that you want to understand the key points of the article you're reading and how it will influence your future research, right? You want to pay attention to how the article is structured, right? It will contain its own literature review. Sometimes if you find an article that you think is fabulous, what you might want to do is read its sources, right? Not the kind of data sources, right? But the literature it's tapping into, because that will give you a kind of idea. If you're trying to figure out what big concept you want to use in a piece of research, right, then that's what you want to be doing, right, is like jumping in and working on those issues. You should pay attention to the literature review and what you're reading. It may not say literature review. Like if you're reading a particular sort of positivist scholarship, yes, it will say literature review, right? Things like the articles you read for the short paper will be differently structured because they will come in with, you know, topics or things like that. It will likely talk about the research design. I think not enough articles talk explicitly about their research design because I'm me. But I think looking at the research design or just whatever it tells you about how it gathered data, right, is important. And then there'll be sections that'll explain what was learned, right? And then, you know, the introduction and conclusion are really helpful for kind of understanding how to situate the article. It is likely that you will want to read things twice. The reason is because the first time it can be really easy to get stuck in the details. So you read the first time just to get the overview, and then you read the second time to take the pieces apart. Some of you guys may remember this is how I recommended you read for your paper that you're reading. All right. So again, kind of this is a good general approach to use. So my slides here are pretty short, and the reason why is I wanted to kind of show you what it actually looks like when you are working on a literature review. So here we're going to do what I suggest you guys do and start with the university's website, right? If I were more together, I would have had a librarian see if they could prepare something for you. I'm in fact going to bother the librarians to see if they have any suggestions or resources. Right, so you're going to start, right? And I'm guessing most of you have done something like this before. So working from the made up question, that I came up with earlier, right? I'm going to start with municipal elections in Canada before I get into talking about language or about Ottawa, right? And I'm going to hit search. When you do this directly off the front page of the website, you are getting anything that is in the library's holdings, right? So let's start with the first thing is an article, a peer-reviewed article, right? This is useful. Remember that the 10 sources you need for your annotated bibliography need to be peer-reviewed, right? This one's peer-reviewed. It's an academic article from a journal called Javnost, I'm guessing it's pronounced, which I don't know anything about, right? So I can't tell you anything about this. So you go down, you'll see, okay, here's a legislative bill, right? Here's a book that's on hold at the law library. Here's an article. This is from 1988, right? This is a bill from, 1854 passed by the legislature, right? So you've got all these things, and they're all over the place, right? So one of the things you can do if you're conducting this kind of research, right, is you can go to new search. Let me just actually go back to the front page, right? You can go to advanced search and you can set some limits. And I strongly recommend you doing this. So let's say you want to say municipal elections in Canada. Now notice I haven't actually narrowed anything here. It's still any field contains, right? But I'm going to say that I want articles. I'm going to say I want them in English. Obviously, you are welcome to use literature in any language you read, right? And I'm going to say I only want things from 1990 and on, right? I'm looking for literature in the last 30 years. In fact, actually, I'm gonna go 2000 and on. Now, academic literature takes a while to publish. It can take years for an article to get written and submitted, and the data collection process is long. So don't think if something hasn't been published in the past 2 years, it's not current. No, things are still current. But also be aware that if you're reading something published in the 90s or in the early 2000s, things might be different, right? Okay, so I do this search, right? Notice that this algorithm is smart enough here, right? And then I'm just gonna click here that I only wanna look at peer-reviewed articles, right? That didn't actually take anything off my list. So I recommend that you look at journal titles, right? The order in which these are coming, right, is determined by relevance, which I feel like when an algorithm says determined by relevance, I don't know what it means because I don't know how the criteria it's using are. Frequently it's great, frequently it's not, right? You can also have it sort in a different way. You have so many results that you should not try to sort them like by author or anything like that. You could reverse sort them by date and get the most recent. That's not terrible, right? But when I look at this, right, like it can be hard to determine, am I looking at something from a good journal? So for instance, I don't know anything about this top journal, right? I do know the American Review of Canadian Studies. It's pretty decent. I know the Canadian Journal of Political Science, and I know that it publishes really good work, right? I don't know the Journal of Information Technology and Politics. However, this one's about Ottawa. So if I'm researching about Ottawa, I'm definitely going to read it, right? Since I'm not working on Calgary, I might not turn to this one because I don't know the journal, right? Now, it could turn out that this article is excellent and I'll come back to it later, right? This article, I can't really tell if it's at all relevant to what I'm doing, so I probably won't read it. This one's from Canadian Journal of Political Science. I will, right? So you can see how I'm going through and making choices about what I'm looking at. You do not need to take the top 10 articles you see here. Okay. So I emphasize that the majority of your articles should be political science articles. I think what I give is that 8 out of 10 articles should be political science articles. What does that mean? That usually means that they're published in a journal that identifies itself as being a journal of political science, or that the author identifies themselves as being an author, a political scientist, right? Whether by their PhD or what department they're in or something like that. Some of you may be dealing with questions that touch on issues of sociology, of criminology, of ethnic studies, whatever, right? So you might be working with material that will contain kind of different things. One of the things I want to point out to you is that you don't just have the library as a resource. So one of the greatest resources that we have is something called Worldwide Political Science Abstracts. right? This is what it sounds like it is. It essentially aggregates scholarship that is identified as being in political science and allows you to only search that, right? Now, the second thing I want to point out is I'm assuming by this point in the pandemic, if not your academic career, you will know how to use proxy servers, right? When you try to access a resource from the library, you will have to go through the proxy server. You'll have to log in with your library resources, okay? And in fact, they're now the same as all of your UAuto credentials. They were different until this year. Just make sure that you know how to do this. Okay, you'll get here. I want to point out that this has all sorts of literature. I found, so when I was working on my PhD dissertation, there were lots of things that weren't well studied, right? Arab American Studies is not a huge field. It's not today. I believe the Arab American Studies Association has like 150 members. We're really excited about it. This is what we're talking about. So I, in fact, found dissertations, right? All sorts of things. You guys only want to look at scholarly journals for the purposes of this, right? I'm not going to select from in here because I think document type I don't know if everything that's an academic article will get classified as an article, right? Some things might get classified as undefined or a report or something like that, right? But then what I want to say is that I want to study municipal elections in Canada, right? Let's go with last 3 years. And again, limit to peer review. Do this to yourself now so you don't end up coming up with a whole bunch of things you can't use. For another project, you might be interested in non-peer reviewed sources. You are not right this second. I'm informing you, you are not, okay? All right, here we go. First one, we actually saw this article before, right? And we saw that article before. Oh, this is a different article I don't think we've seen yet. Oh, this is about schools boards. That's interesting. Huh, this one's about Tunisia. That does not seem to be relevant, right? I don't know if this is useful, right? So you can go through and see what looks useful. But let's say we want to get this one, political parties, women's success in municipal elections in 2005 in Montérégie and Montréal. Okay. The way you get a copy of it, if it's available through ProQuest, you can click full text here, right? If it's not, you click the Afficher button. And what it will do is then take you back to the UAudible library where it will have searched for the article. Let's see if this, I actually didn't check if this works, right? There we go. Okay, you need to go through one of these guys to get it, right? It's very easy. I think I like the platform for Scholar Direct, so I always go with Scholars Portal, whatever it's called, right? There we go. You download the guy, okay? What I want to recommend to you guys as you are working on this project, right, is I want to really strongly recommend that you get to a fairly specific, like you'll notice the level at which I was searching was municipal elections in Canada. I recommend you are at roughly that level. So you might want to write about the Civil War in Colombia. Okay, start at that level, right? That might be a bit big. You might find it too vague, right? You might want to start at, I'm trying to brainstorm things here, right? You might want to start at the Oka crisis, right? Maybe that's what you think you want to focus on. Okay, go for the Oka crisis, right? This is kind of what I'm suggesting, right? The Oka crisis might be too specific. The Civil War in Colombia might be too broad, but you could start with those. You guys need to get from the topic of your group, if you're in a group that's formed around a topic like legislation or something like that, to a searchable topic. If you guys are in a group that founded yourself, you have to get to a searchable topic and not be too specific. Remember, out of your searchable topic, you have to be able to identify 3 research questions that you could potentially investigate, right? They do not need to be identical to each other in any way. But I want to see that you've gotten some kind of level of focus in your group at that point. So this is where you guys are in the class. You're at the point of starting to map out the literature to really understand a topic. It's a necessary skill. It's challenging, but not that challenging, right? Like the biggest challenge I find is not letting it take over your entire life. Because oftentimes I have to tell students now is the time to stop reading and start doing. Um, but you guys don't have the opportunity to do that because you only have a couple weeks to do this thing. There we go. All right, that is it for today. I'm really looking forward to seeing y'all in class. Feel free to come to office hours if you have questions for me. Okay, take care.